Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
When I was 5 years old, my parents told me something that, at the time, I didn't fully understand, and honestly, I don't think they expected me to. They sat me and my twin sister down on the floor of our living room and told us, calmly and without any emotion, that we were no longer going to be two people. From that day forward, we would both be Clara. One identity, one name, one life. And the way they made it sound, almost like it was a favor, a solution to a problem we were too young to see, it didn't feel like a punishment. Not at first. They explained that Clara would go to school, have friends, live a normal life. The other sister, whichever one wasn't Clara that month, would stay downstairs in the basement. It was just temporary, they said. A quiet time. A peaceful break. No big deal. Like taking turns. But what child is supposed to understand what it means to give up their entire existence every 30 days? The basement was clean, not some dirty dungeon or anything like that. But it was locked from the outside. No windows. No books, no television. Just silence and this deep sense of being erased. And we followed their rules. At that age, what else could we do? We thought every family had weird secrets. We thought maybe this was just our version of that. So we switched. Every month, we traded places. And every time I went upstairs and became Clara again, it was like stepping back into a life that had kept going without me, because it had. My teachers never noticed, my classmates didn't know, even our neighbors thought we were one child. My parents made sure of it. They were careful, obsessively so, and any time we slipped, even something as small as mentioning a movie the other hadn't seen, there were consequences. As we got older, we started to feel it more. The resentment. The confusion. The ache of being invisible for half your life. I started noticing how my sister would react when I came up from the basement, how her eyes would scan the room like she was trying to memorize it all in case it was her last turn. I knew, deep down, she was counting the days, just like I was. And sometimes, when it was my turn downstairs, I'd press my ear against the door just to hear life going on without me. Her laughter, the footsteps, the voices on the phone. All these little moments that made me feel like a ghost. We kept going like that for years. I don't even know how we made it through high school without it falling apart, but we did. Our parents had systems. Schedules. Journals for us to read what the other had done. Even a shared phone with a list of approved contacts and topics. It was a prison built out of routines. And we played along mostly because we didn't know how not to. The idea of leaving terrified us more than staying. But by the time we turned 19, something had shifted. We started fighting more. Not out loud, never in front of them, but in the silence, the tension. We started getting competitive. Who was the better Clara? Who got better grades? Who made friends more easily? Who was more believable? And it wasn't even our fault, really. They built it this way. Made us enemies under the same name. The breaking point came one night in March, when I came up from the basement and saw my sister sitting at the kitchen table with a small stack of college brochures. I wasn't supposed to know she was applying anywhere. That wasn't part of the schedule, but there it was. Applications, handwritten notes, essays. She had a life planned that didn't include me. And when I confronted her about it, she didn't deny it. She just looked me in the eye and said, "I can't do this forever." That was the first time I realized we might not both survive this game. One of us was going to have to walk away. Or be pushed. A few days later, I collapsed in the bathroom. It was sudden. My vision blurred, my stomach twisted, and then there was blood, a lot of it. Enough that I knew something was seriously wrong. I don't remember passing out, but I remember waking up on the floor and seeing my parents standing over me, calm as ever, not even looking panicked. My sister was behind them, eyes wide, like she was about to scream, but didn't. They didn't call an ambulance. They didn't rush me to the hospital. Instead, they helped me to the couch, gave me a towel, and sat us both down at the kitchen table. What they said next didn't sound real. Not even close. They looked at us like they were giving us some kind of chore assignment. No drama. No fear. Just cold, flat reality. They told us we had 1 week to decide. 1 week to choose which Clara would continue and which one of us would go away. Not a joke. Not a threat. Just a deadline. They made it sound so simple. Like it was just another month of switching, except this time, one of us wouldn't be coming back. And that was the moment something inside me broke, or maybe it finally woke up. I looked at my sister, and she looked at me, and I saw the fear in her eyes. But I also saw something else. A question we had never asked each other until then. If it comes down to me or you, who do you choose? Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If you spent your whole life being erased half the time, treated like a spare part, and one day someone calmly told you that only one version of you gets to survive, would you let your sister go and live the life you were denied? Or would you finally, for the first time, take it all back, even if it meant doing something that would change you forever? Because in that moment, I knew we weren't going to beg. We weren't going to pick. We weren't going to play along anymore. We were going to choose them. After that night, the silence between me and my sister felt like something we had to tiptoe around, like a fault line waiting to split, because even though we sat across from each other every day, pretending to be fine, we both knew we were counting down to something we couldn't define, not just a decision, but a kind of death sentence, and neither of us knew whose name was already written on it. Our parents, in the meantime, carried on as if they'd told us to decide who gets the bigger room or who takes the first shower, like it was a practical matter that needed resolving. Not a psychological bomb dropped on two daughters who had already spent most of their lives pretending not to exist. They didn't speak of it again after that first conversation. There was no follow-up, no questions, no lectures, no apologies, just the expectation that we would come back to them in exactly 7 days with a name, one name, and no discussion. That's how they worked. That's how it had always been. And the worst part? There was a part of me that wasn't even surprised. Somewhere deep down, I think I always knew they were capable of this. Not because they hated us, but because they simply didn't care who we really were as individuals. To them, Clara was the product, the project, the mask, and we were the pieces behind it, the replaceable machinery keeping the illusion alive. For the first couple of days, we didn't talk about it. We tried to distract ourselves, half-hearted TV, pacing the halls, sitting in the same room without making eye contact. There were moments I'd catch her looking at me with this strange mixture of pity and calculation, like she was trying to guess what I was thinking, but also deciding whether or not it was useful to her. And I hated that I was doing the same thing. I started analyzing her every move, trying to figure out if she was planning something behind my back, some letter, some escape plan, some deal with them. And the more I noticed her being quiet, the more paranoid I became, until I caught myself watching her sleep and thinking, if I go back down to the basement tomorrow, I might never come back up. Then on the third night, I walked past my parents' bedroom, a room I normally avoided out of instinct, because nothing good ever came from being too close to where decisions were made, and I heard them talking. Not arguing, not whispering, just talking, as if this whole situation was a routine check-in. I froze just outside the door, listening through the thin wall, and that's when I heard my mother say something I'll never forget, something that made my stomach flip so hard I thought I'd be sick right there in the hallway. She said, "I think it should be the one who bled. She's weaker. It makes sense." And my father just replied, I was thinking the same. No hesitation. No concern. No fear. Just a matter-of-fact consensus, like they were discussing groceries. I stood there frozen, trying not to breathe too loud, feeling this cold rush sweep through my body because in that moment, it was confirmed they had already chosen. It didn't matter what we decided. It was already done. I was the one who bled. I was the one they saw as weak. And they had no intention of letting me walk away with my life. I waited until the house went quiet, until I could hear my father snoring and my mother's footsteps had faded back into stillness, and then I crept down into the basement where my sister was lying on the mattress, staring at the ceiling like she was waiting for something. When I told her what I heard, she didn't say anything at first. Her face didn't change. She just closed her eyes, and after a long pause, said quietly, "Then we have 4 days." I didn't know what she meant at first. I thought maybe she was accepting it, accepting that they would get to decide who lived and who didn't, like they always had. But then she opened her eyes again and added, "We don't decide which one of us dies. We decide what they never see coming. From that moment on, everything shifted between us. It was like a wall fell. For the first time in years, we were on the same side again, not as Clara, not as competitors, but as two girls who had been lied to, used, locked away, and forced to trade their identities like poker chips in a game they never asked to play. The rage we had buried for so long was no longer buried. It was right there at the surface, and it gave us clarity. Not just about what had to be done, but how we were going to do it. The next day, we started observing their habits, their bedtime routines, how much wine they drank, where they kept their medications. We took notes. We didn't speak of the plan out loud, only passed each other short nods and glances when the time felt right. Every step we took felt like waking up after a lifetime of sleepwalking. It was terrifying, yes, but it also felt, and I won't lie about this, thrilling. For the first time, we were in control. And that control made us dangerous. We knew one thing for sure: if we waited until the last day, they'd expect it. They'd be watching us, ready to carry out their little decision, ready to erase me like they had rehearsed. But if we acted early, if we caught them off guard, if we made the first move, then maybe, just maybe, we'd walk away with both of us intact. But that's the thing about planning revenge inside a house built on lies. There's always one variable you don't expect. And mine came late that night when I found a small envelope tucked behind the old bookshelf in the basement, something hidden so clumsily it was almost like someone wanted it to be found. Inside was a letter, in my sister's handwriting, dated almost 6 months ago. And what it said changed everything. The letter wasn't long, but it didn't have to be, because every word inside it felt like a match thrown onto a floor soaked in gasoline, and as I read it alone, crouched by that damp wall in the basement, barely breathing, I realized with a kind of creeping dread that while I had spent the last few days preparing for war side by side with the one person I believed was finally on my side, she had already started fighting a different war without me, and I wasn't sure anymore whether I was her partner or her target. The letter started off like a journal entry, casual and reflective, something a girl might write when she's trying to keep herself sane after spending days locked away in a concrete box pretending she doesn't exist. But halfway through, the tone changed, and what I read felt like a confession wrapped in a warning, not to me, but to them. My parents. Because it wasn't addressed to me at all. It was addressed to Mom and Dad. She had written it 6 months ago. And in it, she talked about how hard it was to keep lying to me, how tired she was of pretending she still believed in the switching, how she knew they were going to have to make a choice eventually, and how, if they did, she was willing to be the one who stayed. She didn't say it cruelly. She didn't say she wanted me gone. But the way she wrote about me, it was like I was already slipping away, like my usefulness was running out. She mentioned my health issues, the fact that I was becoming emotionally unstable, how I was questioning the system more and more. She told them she was worried I might start fighting back in a way that could expose everything. And then came the last line: if it comes down to it, I can take care of it. Just give me time. I didn't know how to interpret that at first. It sounded like a threat. It sounded like a plan. It sounded like betrayal in its most calculated form, and I sat there rereading that last sentence over and over again until my eyes hurt, trying to convince myself that maybe it meant something else, that maybe take care of it meant something softer, more desperate, more human. But I knew her handwriting. I knew her voice. And there was no hesitation in that sentence. There was no fear, no uncertainty, just confidence. For the next hour, I paced the basement in circles, trying to pull myself together, trying not to fall into the trap of assuming the worst. Maybe she wrote it in a moment of weakness. Maybe they pressured her into it. Maybe she regretted it. But those excuses didn't hold up when I started putting the pieces together. Over the past few months, there had been moments, strange ones, quiet ones, that suddenly made more sense. Times when she volunteered to switch early, when she suddenly backed down in arguments, when she insisted I take the upstairs shifts during holidays, all things I had chalked up to sisterly kindness, but now, in the shadow of that letter, looked a lot more like strategy. So when she came down to the basement later that night, carrying 2 mugs of tea like she always did before bed, part of our new truce routine, I didn't say anything about the letter. I didn't ask her why she wrote it. I didn't ask her whether the plan she and I had been building was really our plan or just hers. Instead, I smiled. I took the tea, and I drank it slowly, waiting to see if she would bring it up. She didn't. She sat across from me on the mattress, legs tucked under her, sipping like it was just another quiet night in our shared prison. And that told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't changed her mind. She was still choosing herself. But here's the thing she didn't know. I had already decided I wasn't going to let her win. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I watched her sleep for a few minutes, not because I was afraid of her, but because I was trying to understand what part of her had finally let go of me, what part had decided I was expendable. And as much as I wanted to be angry, to feel pure rage at the betrayal, what I felt instead was this strange, aching emptiness. Like mourning someone who hadn't died yet but already felt gone. I didn't confront her. I didn't call her a liar. I didn't flip the whole house upside down. Instead, I went back upstairs and smiled at my mother in the kitchen. I offered to help with the groceries. I made myself useful. I did what Clara would do. Because now I had a plan too. And unlike hers, mine didn't rely on anyone else's permission. Over the next 2 days, I played along. I pretended the countdown was still in motion, that we were both still struggling to decide who deserved to live. I kept quiet. I let her think I was broken, that the pressure was getting to me, that maybe I'd given up. I even started writing a letter of my own, left it somewhere I knew she'd find it. A few pages of fake surrender, of sad little apologies, and a final line that said, "If you're reading this, it means I've chosen to disappear." By the time I saw her reading it, tucked in the bathroom behind a locked door, I knew it had worked. She bought it. She thought I'd cracked. She thought I was going to step aside. That night, she brought me wine instead of tea. A rare gift from our parents, something they only offered on special occasions, and we both pretended it was a celebration of our peace. One last drink before decisions had to be made. But the moment I tasted it, I knew it was different. Not just the flavor. The aftertaste. Bitter. Heavy. Something added. I waited until she finished her glass before pouring mine into the sink behind her back. I made sure to yawn, to stretch, to pretend the drowsiness was mutual. And when she finally curled up on the mattress, blinking slow and struggling to keep her eyes open, I whispered, "Sleep tight." Because I wasn't the one who drank it. And I wasn't the one who was going to disappear. Not anymore. When I was a child, the scariest sound in the world wasn't the creak of the stairs at night, or the howl of wind against the windows, or even the silence of the basement that wrapped itself around me like a second skin. No. It was the sound of my parents' voices behind a closed door, speaking in that calm, icy tone they reserved for making decisions no child should ever have been part of. And now, all these years later, as I stood in the hallway with my heart pounding hard against my ribs and my fingers clenched so tightly they had gone numb, I realized I was about to become the voice behind the door, the one making the final decision, and I wasn't scared anymore. Not of them, not of what would happen next, and certainly not of who I would have to become to end it. She was out cold by the time I tiptoed back down to the basement, sprawled sideways on the mattress, breathing steady, mouth slightly open, and for a moment, I just watched her, trying to figure out what part of me still remembered this face as mine, as family, as something I should save rather than leave behind. But the truth is, that feeling was gone, burned out by the letter, by the look in her eyes every time she thought I was too dumb to see what she was doing, by the way she kept talking about our future like it only ever had room for one of us. And maybe that's the part people would struggle to understand, that sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from hatred, but from someone calmly choosing themselves over you again and again, all while pretending they're doing it out of love. I didn't have to tie her up or lock her in. She'd already done the work for me, underestimating me so thoroughly that she made herself vulnerable without a fight. And when I took her key, the one she kept hidden in the lining of her pillowcase, just in case she ever needed to leave without me, I remember thinking that if the roles were reversed, she would have used it days ago, quietly slipping out while I slept and letting the world believe I had vanished on my own. And that thought, that Certainty made what I did next feel less like a crime and more like a correction. I went upstairs just before midnight, stepped over the loose floorboard my father always warned us not to touch, and found them exactly where I expected, sitting at the dining table with matching glasses of scotch and that smug, distant look that always meant they were too proud of something to speak about it yet. And when my mother asked where my sister was, I smiled and told her she was resting, that she was finally at peace with everything, that she wasn't going to fight anymore, and I watched as that tiny flicker of satisfaction passed between their eyes like a signal, like confirmation that their plan had worked again. That's when I set the drinks down. They didn't ask questions, not even a curious glance about where the wine had come from, how I had gotten it, why I was offering it now, of all times, because people like them don't expect consequences, they don't expect pushback. They certainly don't expect to be outmaneuvered by the children they spent 2 decades molding into shadows of themselves, and that arrogance is exactly what let me win. I had started small, just enough to dull their senses, sleeping pills crushed and stirred into the bottom of the bottle, nothing that would kill them, nothing that would even make them pass out too quickly, just enough to make their movements sluggish, their thinking foggy. Enough to ensure that by the time they realized what was happening, it would already be too late. I waited until they started blinking slow, rubbing their eyes, glancing at the clock like time had suddenly jumped forward, and then I stood, calm and patient, and I told them that the decision had been made, that Clara was gone, and that I wasn't interested in being anyone other than myself anymore. My father tried to speak first, something about this being irrational, that there were long-term plans still in place, that I couldn't possibly understand the consequences, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and his glass slipped out of his hand, shattering across the floor, and he stared at it like it had betrayed him, like even the objects in this house were turning against him. My mother didn't speak at all. She just stood, stumbled, reached for the edge of the counter, and missed. I didn't wait for them to collapse. I walked out. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't leave a note. I didn't even take money. I just turned off the lights, one by one, as I walked down the hallway, past the room where my sister still slept under the haze of the wine she had intended for me, and I didn't feel guilt or regret or anything close to sorrow, because none of this, not the switches, not the basement, not the lies, had ever been mine to carry, and now I was done carrying it. I locked the front door behind me, slowly, deliberately, making sure the key clicked into place before I dropped it through the mail slot and walked down the steps, and with every step, I could still hear them, faintly, behind the walls, starting to panic. Starting to realize their bodies wouldn't respond the way they expected, that their voices weren't loud enough, that their authority had evaporated like the scotch they were still trying to swallow. They were screaming by the time I reached the street, calling our names, begging for someone to help. But there was no one coming, because Clara was gone. And in her place, there was only me. There's this strange moment that comes after you do something irreversible, a moment that isn't exactly peace, but it also isn't fear. It sits somewhere in the middle, suspended like a held breath, and as I walked away from the house that night, leaving my parents half-conscious and screaming inside a place they had always treated more like a theater than a home, and with my sister unconscious downstairs, in the same room where I once sat for hours trying to remember what my own voice sounded. Like when no one was listening, I felt that moment stretch out in front of me like a hallway with no doors, and I wasn't entirely sure if I was walking toward freedom or into something even darker, but I knew one thing without a shred of doubt: Clara was dead. And she wasn't coming back. I didn't go far, at least not that first night. There wasn't any dramatic bus station escape or wild drive across state lines, because despite everything I'd planned and rehearsed in my head, the reality was that once you stop being Clara, once you shed that name and the performance it demanded every second of every day, you're not automatically someone else. You're just nothing for a while, just a blank page with ink stains from someone else's handwriting still bleeding through. And I needed time to figure out who I even was without the calendar, without the switch, without the silent war that had lived under our skin since we were old enough to read each other's lies. I stayed in a cheap motel 2 towns over, the kind of place that didn't ask questions as long as you paid in cash, and I watched the local news every night just to see if anything would come up, a missing persons report, a break-in. Some bizarre domestic story about two wealthy, reclusive parents found drugged in their own home, while one daughter vanished and the other refused to speak. But there was nothing, not even a whisper, which told me exactly what I needed to know. They weren't going to the police. They weren't going to make noise. They weren't going to risk the whole twisted truth unraveling in the public eye, because if anyone found out what they'd done about the fake identity, about the forced switches, about the locked basement and the erased birthdays and the decades-long lie they'd passed off as parenting, they wouldn't just lose control, they'd lose everything. And that silence? That was the first time they ever gave me power. 3 days later, I got a text. Not from my sister, not from them, from a number I didn't recognize, but the message was simple, cold, and unmistakably theirs. Return home by Friday or we'll decide for you. That was all it said. No names. No threats spelled out. Just the same manipulative tone they'd always used, dressed up as concern, as order, as routine. And what they didn't realize, what they had never been able to comprehend, was that I wasn't the same girl they used to lock in the basement with storybooks and a journal full of fake memories. I wasn't someone they could threaten into obedience anymore, because the second they gave me a choice, even if they thought they were controlling the outcome, they broke their own illusion. And now that I could see it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. But what haunted me more than them, more than their silence or their threats or the cold logic I knew they were still applying to every second of this crisis, was my sister. Because after all of it, the letter, the wine, the silence we had built like armor, I still didn't know what she would do next. Would she wake up and turn on them? Or on me? Would she lie, pretend to remember nothing, beg them for forgiveness, try to step back into Clara's shoes like the whole thing had never happened? Or would she finally do the thing neither of us had been able to manage all those years, walk away? I didn't want to find out the hard way. So I went back. Not to apologize. Not to explain. But to finish what I started. It was early morning when I arrived. The house looked unchanged, perfectly still, the kind of place where secrets settle into the walls like dust and stay there long after the people are gone, and I didn't knock. I used the spare key my father kept in the broken birdhouse out front, and when I stepped inside, I half expected to be ambushed, interrogated, dragged into some new manipulation with tears and lectures and psych evaluations. But the house was quiet. Too quiet. She was sitting in the kitchen, hands folded, eyes tired, hair still damp from a shower she probably hadn't planned to take that day. She looked up when I walked in, didn't flinch, didn't speak, just looked at me like I was both the villain and the answer, and maybe I was. I asked her one question. Did you tell them it was me? She shook her head slowly, and for a moment, I believed her. She said she woke up hours after I left, confused, angry, scared, that she tried to call me but my phone was off, that she screamed until her voice broke and the door finally opened, that our parents didn't say a word, just stared at her like she was a stranger, like they couldn't figure out which one of us had betrayed them worse. She said she hadn't told them anything, not about the wine, not about the letter, not about the plan that had fallen apart the second she realized I was never going to let her decide my ending for me. I wanted to believe her. But then I asked her another question. Are you still Clara? And she didn't answer. That silence told me everything. Because even after everything, even after I walked away, even after they screamed for help and nobody came, even after the system cracked and the house fell silent, she still didn't know how to be anything else. She was still waiting for her turn. Still hoping the game could start over. Still thinking that maybe, just maybe, the rules could be rewritten if she played them a little better next time. So I left again. Not with rage. Not with grief. Just with the understanding that some people never leave the basement, not because they're locked inside, but because they've convinced themselves it's safer down there. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. Because Clara's dead. And I don't plan on ever bringing her back.